right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday morning. Today starts part 2 of our 11-part cybersecurity series, sponsored by Ohio SBDC and PTAC, and presented by Totem Technology. So before I hand it over to Nathan, also want to just remind you, please use the chat features and the question and answer feature. We do really encourage communication throughout. Ask questions, add comments. We want to try and make this as interactive as possible. Today's session will be recorded. We will send out that recording following the webinar. Slides will be used throughout this whole series, and so that will be distributed at the end of the series. So with that said, I think that's all the housekeeping. So Nathan, I'll turn it over to you.
Sweet. Thanks, Joey. Welcome back, everybody. Super excited to have you all here. Before we jump into the presentation, I wanted to share some recent news events with you guys. I think hopefully in light of what we talked about last week, find pretty relevant. Get this out of the way. Looks like the University of Pittsburgh was hit by a phishing scam just last week. In fact, this news report came out the day that we talked about our own phishing scam. We ran through that simulation. So it looks like the university got hit with this phishing scam, and it appeared to be coming from the IT help desk. So that's not good. And just looking through this, it looks like the attackers actually created a fake login portal, and they actually did a pretty good job making it look real. And they sent this guy out to students and faculty and staff, and essentially tried to get them to enter in their credentials so that they could harvest them and do whatever malicious things they intended to do with that. In fact, the university tweeted that same day, the same day the event took place, which appeared to be the 25th, so a little over a week ago, they sent out this tweet warning everybody what was going on. They included a screenshot of what the message looked like. As you can see, they made it look as though it was coming from the help desk at the university. And the subject and the message, you have a new message unread from the University of Pittsburgh. This would raise an alarm in my mind, just the fact that every word in this is capitalized, and you have some redundancy here. They say the same thing twice. It's a little strange, so I'd be a little suspicious because of that. And then they took out the link. So I just want to share this with you guys real quick. That, I mean, like phishing, I say phishing is a real threat. And I mean, this is one reason why we see it everywhere. And hence why I was pretty adamant last week that phishing is one of the many different attacks that we need to be conscious of and trying to protect our organizations from. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today. So let me go ahead and pull the slides here. Everyone can see that okay. All right. Soon stuff out of the way. All right, perfect. So welcome back, everybody. I am super glad that you've all joined us again this morning. This is our Totem Top 10 series. For those who may be joining us for the first time, my name is Nathan, and I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Totem Technologies. And this is our series on basic cybersecurity hygiene, and specifically the 10 most important cybersecurity safeguards that we recommend you implement to lower your cybersecurity risk. Joey mentioned the housekeeping reminders. Feel free to use the chat or the Q&A feature to input your questions, and we'll be sure to answer those. I'll pull this up actually. I will be monitoring these during the duration, so feel free to type them in at any time. I'll be sure to answer those. Well, today I'm excited because we're kicking off with our very first safeguard, which is to know your assets. And this control is really going to set the groundwork for the rest of our controls in this series. We're going to talk a lot about this, but really everything else that we want to implement during this series, and everything that we talk about is going to be predicated on this control. Without this being our keystone, so to speak, the rest of the Totem top 10 simply can't be successful. When I say know your assets, we're going to be talking about a number of different things, particularly how your company's sensitive information, your hardware and your software, the things that comprise a complete IT system inventory are really the building blocks to building a cybersecurity program. And so to do this, we're going to start by identifying first what information are we protecting, or what are we maybe required to protect. And we're going to identify the life cycle, we call the life cycle of this information. We're then going to take a look at the related IT system components that help facilitate that information life cycle. And then once we have all of these things answered, all of these things laid out, we can then begin to create our own robust IT system inventory, which will be a resource that you will be using for many years to come, most likely. We're going to be looking at a couple different tools today. Our first is our system inventory template, which is going to help really do a lot of the legwork for us as far as establishing our IT system inventory. That's going to be a document that hopefully you, if you choose to use it, you will be readily relying upon rather for a long time. And we're also going to take a brief look at Nmap, which is basically a free security scanner that will help us gather the information that we need for our IT system inventory. So just a quick overview. And one other note, I mentioned my name and who I am. If you have any questions anytime outside of this workshop, feel free to email me. My email is nathan@totem.tech. And if you are on LinkedIn and are curious about what's happening in the cybersecurity arena, or maybe particularly in the DoD contracting world, feel free to connect with me, and it'll be a fun time. Well, before we dive in, I did want to give a quick review of what we discussed last week. I started off the session by highlighting a number of what I would call ugly truths that we as Totem Tech have observed over the years when it comes to small business cybersecurity. The first being that we as small businesses tend to be way too overconfident in our cybersecurity, even though we are relying on maybe old habits, or we think that cybersecurity risks don't apply to us because we are small businesses. We talked about how some of us have bought into the myth that, oh, hackers only care about the big businesses because, well, that's where the money is, right? And we sort of debunked that myth by going over, what are some of the most clear vulnerabilities within small businesses that make them prime targets for hackers. A couple of those being, well, first, our users aren't trained to be able to spot and prevent some of the most concerning cyber threats like phishing. We also talked about how our systems are not secure. We may be relying on old or outdated software, or our IT system inventory just isn't where it needs to be. And so all of these collective vulnerabilities really puts a huge target on our backs. And because of that, it gives us concern for our cybersecurity. We talked a lot about phishing last week to demonstrate sort of how something like a phishing email could exploit these obvious weaknesses in small businesses. We walked through a phishing simulation where I analyzed an actual phishing email that we received a few years ago, that's seen on the screen here. We discovered that embedded deep within the Word document, that invoice.doc there, was some malicious code that would reach out to the internet and pull back and install a keylogger on the victim machine. A keylogger being basically a program that monitors and forwards your keystrokes, everything that you're typing in to another destination. We also saw that in total, nearly 2,000 changes were made to the registry, to essentially like the brain of the victim machine, which makes it nearly impossible to try and reverse once it's been infected. And so collectively, we just saw the damage that something like a simple phishing email can do, and why it is one of, if not the greatest threats facing all businesses of all sizes. And it highlighted the need for small businesses to think about how to mitigate the risk of a successful phishing attack. We also talked about how cybersecurity can be boiled down to simply risk management. There are simply way too many threats, way too many vulnerabilities out there for us to be able to manage everything. So I encourage us to, instead of approaching cybersecurity from the perspective of, I must prevent all the bad things from happening, we should instead approach it from the perspective of, okay, what things can I do to lower the risk of something bad happening? And this led us to our Totem Top 10, the need for a layered, what we call layered defense in depth approach to cybersecurity, where we have different cybersecurity safeguards sort of linking together, joining together, where if one of the safeguards fails or isn't effective, another one can step up. And this ultimately brought us to our Totem Top 10. This is not, I understand that this is not going to work perfectly for every organization. This is our recommendation. This is also what works for us, and it's what a lot of the world's leading cybersecurity organizations are already recommending. But this is our defense in-depth strategy for cybersecurity hygiene on a basic level. And this is where we are currently in the series. We're starting off with our very first session, which is super exciting. Note that next week, we're going to be talking about user training, specifically cybersecurity user training, and how, in my opinion, it's arguably the most effective control on this list in terms of actually preventing cyber threats. So we're going to dig into that pretty deep. It's still an element in the defense in depth, and so therefore it requires other controls around it, but it's quite effective in terms of actually dealing with cyber threats. So it's going to be an awesome session. Hope you can join us next week. Well, let's get started. So I keep saying to know your assets. What exactly do we mean when we say to know your assets? Well, we're really talking about gathering a complete IT system inventory. This, again, includes the information, the hardware, and the software that we use and that we process. Before you are going to go look to add more technology into your IT environment, you first need to know what is presently there. And this inventory is what's going to build the foundation for our cybersecurity journey moving forward. And honestly, like, how can you even know what you're protecting with the rest of these Totem Top 10 controls if we don't even have an idea of what's living inside our own environment? So we're starting with the basics here with our cybersecurity program. Well, why is it important really to know your assets? Like, what are the actual benefits? Well, a couple that come to mind for me is that first, we're already spending lots of money on our IT assets, like our hardware and software, but we're then failing to adequately manage them. It's kind of like you hire someone to do a job, and then you stick them in a corner and tell them to just, okay, just do your thing, completely forgetting about them. And you never train them, you never check in with them, you never see what needs they might have, you never look over their work, and you just sort of forget about them. Well, when we do the same thing with our IT assets, they actually start to wither away and lose their value over time. And after enough time of these things going unmanaged, they actually start, after enough time of these things going unmanaged, they actually start to do us more harm than good. And well, why is that? For example, an example that comes to my mind is an IT system inventory can help us stay on top of vulnerabilities within our own environment. If I purchased a server like 10 years ago, but I had no idea that it's what we call end of life date was 3 years ago, meaning that 3 years ago that server stopped receiving any updates or patches or any support. This, as a result, would expose me and my company to significant cybersecurity risk. If instead, once we purchased that server, we logged all the important information about that hardware component in our IT system inventory, we'd be prepared for when that asset was approaching its end of life, and we'd be able to take the proper steps to ensure that it didn't reach that point to protect us from the vulnerabilities that would occur as a result. We have learned as even a small business that does not have very much IT infrastructure, relatively speaking, of course, it's a tall task to try and stay on top of all the information that comes with an IT, all the IT systems in our own environment. It's quite challenging to try and manage all this without something like an IT system inventory. There are just way too many moving pieces, and our day-to-day business kind of like it can be a little distracting, and so we tend to forget everything that's going on and that needs updates. This thing's approaching its end of life. We just hired a new person. We need to reimage all these. We need to reimage this computer, and all of these things are changing. So an IT system inventory is what's going to help us manage all of these things. Okay, so hopefully by this point, I've pleaded my case enough, and now it sort of makes sense why an IT system inventory is both a necessary cybersecurity component and also just a huge benefit to us. Let's take a look at the steps that you should be taking to begin building your own IT system inventory. And it ultimately is going to boil down to these 4 questions here. First, what information deserves or even requires protection? Next, what is the life cycle of this information? Third, which IT system components or our assets help facilitate this life cycle? And then finally, how are our systems connecting to and sharing information with other systems? These are the questions that we must answer in order to build our IT system inventory. And so we're going to go ahead and tackle these one at a time as we look to do so. So the first thing that we need to do as we're looking to know our assets is we first must identify the information that we are protecting. The first question to ask is there information that you are required by law or by contract to protect? And aside from the required information, what other information should you be protecting? Keep in mind that this sensitive information, whatever it is ultimately and most likely what hackers are after. This sensitive information is what enables them to wreak havoc on your company and others as well. They know that you value it, and so in turn it becomes valuable to them. And that's really why we are here. It's why we're here today. That's why Totem exists. We need cybersecurity because we have information that requires protection. But I also keep using the word protection. What does that mean? Well, let's clarify that real fast. If you were to pop into like a cybersecurity boot camp or go enroll at your local university in some cybersecurity program, I can almost guarantee that on day one, this model here is going to be shown to you. This is known as the CIA triad, and no, that's not the Central Intelligence Agency. This model is essentially the backbone of information security. It's what we all need to be thinking about when we want to protect our information. The CIA standing for confidentiality, which means that in a given group of information or whatever, it means that there's no unauthorized access to that information. Only those who are supposed to have access are doing so, and nobody else. Integrity, the second component, means that there is no unauthorized changing or manipulation of the information. So data should only be altered or changed if it's supposed to be by people who are supposed to be changing it. And the last component is availability, which basically means that the assets that are handling or protecting this information are always up and running, that they're always available when they're supposed to be. This could include things like your servers, your networking devices, your firewalls, just to name a few. That these things need to be up and operational when they're supposed to be. So protection refers to fulfilling each of these three core tenets. And failure to do so, failure to achieve confidentiality or integrity or availability, failure in any one of these could mean that our information, it does mean, it's not could, it does mean that our information is at greater risk for being compromised. And so we need the appropriate cybersecurity safeguards in place to ensure that these requirements are being met. Okay, so we have kind of an idea of the end goal in achieving information security. But how do we know what is considered sensitive information? Well, I would say, long story short, that's probably a conversation that your organization needs to have internally to determine exactly what information you would consider sensitive and thus worth protecting. But we can look at some different categories of sensitive information to generate some ideas of what we should be protecting. And in fact, probably what your customers are expecting you to be protecting. And know that several of these are intertwined with one another. They're not exactly mutually exclusive. But some of the ones that came to mind for me were first being personal information. You may have heard this labeled as PII, personally identifiable information. This is really any information that can uniquely identify an individual. This includes things like your name, your social security number, date of birth, financial info, even employee info. But that's like the physical stuff that we can see or touch, sort of. PII also extends to like digital information, like IP addresses, login credentials, even like biometrics, like my fingerprint. So PII is quite broad and extends into these other categories of sensitive information as well. But it's really just anything that can uniquely identify someone or something. The second is business information, which really is anything that would harm an organization if it were to be publicly disclosed or maybe acquired by a competitor, which could include things like trade secrets, intellectual property, patent documents, those sorts of things. The last type of sensitive information is government. There are so many different types of government information. I only listed a few here. In our case, since we are a prime Department of Defense contractor, we are required by in our contract to protect controlled unclassified information, or CUI. This information isn't quite sensitive enough that it's considered classified, but it's still important enough that it needs to be controlled or protected. And an example of CUI could be like engineering drawings or technical documents referring to the creation of some material which is going to be used for some greater purpose. And depending on your industry, you may even be required to protect other types of information. I'm not going to go into depth with these, but there are lots of very well-known data standards out there that we should be aware of, like FERPA, which describes protecting academic data, HIPAA, which describes protecting medical data, DMCA for copyright or proprietary data. So I would highly encourage you that step one is to sit down with organizational stakeholders and determine, okay, what sensitive information are we trying to protect here? Once we've identified this information and we know the information that is important to us and therefore worthy of protection, we're good to move on to the next step. And the second step is, what is the life cycle of this information? Now that we know the information, we need to identify this information's life cycle. In other words, how is this information traveling throughout our organization? What sort of things is it touching? You'll see in the next step that this is really going to impact how we handle the physical and digital assets that facilitate this life cycle. You'll see at the bottom here that to get sort of an idea of where this information is going and what it's affecting, you want to refer to this life cycle down at the bottom. So our goal here is to determine how first information is received and or generated. Are you receiving it from a customer or a vendor? Are you generating it internally? If you are receiving it, how is it being sent? Who in your organization is handling it? Where is the information residing when it's first received or generated? We want to work our way through these who, what, when, where, why sorts of questions, with each of these steps in the life cycle. Next, we want to look at how information is stored. Where is it being stored? How long is it being stored? What protections are in place to ensure that sensitive information is stored in a safe manner? Like, is it being encrypted? Third, how is the data being accessed? What devices or users are accessing the information? How often is this data being accessed? How are you ensuring that only authorized users are accessing that information? Fourth is, how is information being transmitted, particularly outside of the organization? Who is transmitting it? How often? Where are they sending it? We're going to look at this particular step in greater detail when we look at our fourth big question, but we need to consider how it's being sent outside of our organization. And then finally, how is the information being disposed of? Is there a specific framework that you are required to follow that dictates how to dispose of the sensitive information? In our case, we do. And that standard is NIST 800-88. So we have to keep that in mind and follow those requirements anytime we want to dispose of sensitive information. This life cycle takes a decent amount of time and thought to identify. I mentioned earlier that you're going to want to get all your stakeholders in a room and talk about these things. Well, this step as well. When we walk through this exercise with our clients, we encourage them to gather folks from all different departments into the same room so that we can collaboratively identify everywhere that this information is traveling. And so we would encourage you to do the same thing. Let's now take a look at what the information lifecycle for something like an engineering drawing, which I mentioned earlier, could look like. And to do this, we're going to be using our CUI and system inventory template, which you can download for free on our free tools page. I have the link here on the screen, but let me show you where that is real fast. So this is our website, totem.tech. I'll throw this in the chat. Free tools website just up here. That's the link directly to the page, but if you need to get there later, it's just resources and then free tools. This is what the page looks like. This is the specific resource that we are going to be using today. And in fact, throughout the course of this series, we're going to be using this template. So highly encourage you to grab one if you'd like. You certainly don't have to, but this is where you can find it. The future is on our free tools page. So anyways, pull that guy up. This is what it looks like. I did tailor it a little bit for this series. Some things will be different, but this is what we're interested in. So for now, we care about the CUI inventory sheet. That's what it will say for you when you download it. I change it to sensitive information inventory because we're not just talking about CUI. I know not everyone here handles CUI. We do, but this really could be applied to any sensitive information, which is why I kind of wanted to tailor it to do so. But this is where we would want to characterize and record the life cycle of the sensitive information that we are handling. As you can see here, we have each specific category of the life cycle, and then we've identified the who, where, when, how, and we want to do that for every single step throughout the life cycle. So we want to sit down and think, okay, something like an engineering drawing. Who generates it internally? Well, our engineering staff. Where are they doing so? On their workstations. When are they doing this? Monthly or as often as needed. How are they doing this? They're using their software development kit, their CAD programs, their engineering drawing programs, those sorts of things. How is the information being stored? Who is storing it? Where are they storing it? How often? So I won't continue to push this point, but this sheet on our template is really helpful for just writing out in clear details every single step of the information lifecycle and starting to get some sort of an idea of where this information is going. So again, highly encourage you to sit down with your stakeholders and start thinking through these things. Back to our presentation. At this point, we have identified our information's life cycle. So now's the time to start to begin to understanding what this looks like in the context of our network and of our IT assets that we manage. This step could take a while, and it's really where we're going to start to get our hands dirty. So I've been saying over and over again that this is a collaborative effort. You're definitely going to need to work with your IT staff on this one. So first, you're going to want to list out all of your IT hardware that helps facilitate your sensitive information lifecycle. This is going to be your workstations, your phones, your servers, your firewalls, printers, camera systems, any of the physical components within your network. Definitely do not forget about those random smart devices either, like the smart refrigerators or thermostats or doorbells. If you have those in your environment, in our case, it's a treadmill. I don't like those, to be honest. I think they're a huge security risk to bring onto your network. And we're actually going to talk a lot more about that when we talk about our 7th control, which is to segment your network. But if you have these in your environment, don't forget about them. I would say it's better to cast a super wide net in terms of jotting down all of our IT components than leave something like a smart refrigerator, a super high risk device out of scope. But to bring it all back around, just make sure you list out all of your important hardware, and don't forget about those silly smart devices. Once you've done this, it's time to start gathering specific information about each of those hardware components. We recommend that you start by gathering all of the makes, the models, IP addresses, MAC addresses, and open ports for everything that you've listed if relevant. All these things aren't going to apply to every device, but for most of them they will. So we recommend that you start with this. Now you're probably wondering, okay, I don't even know what all those mean. And even if I did, where on earth am I supposed to find all that? And there are a number of ways to do so. Some of these take more time to find than others, but at Totem, we use a program called Nmap to assist us with this information gathering. Nmap is essentially a free and open source asset / security scanner. And it can help you find most of the things that I've listed here on the screen. It is a command line tool, meaning that you would use it in something like command prompt. But there are tools out there that actually take Nmap and add a nice user interface to make it more friendly. There's one called ZenMap that comes to mind. So I honestly prefer the command line version, but you may prefer to use that. I can show you real quick what sorts of things you can expect to gather from Nmap scan. Go ahead and just Google some examples here. So this is what the command line version of Nmap looks like after you've run a scan. This is a very specific scan on a very specific host. But some of the things that I mentioned we need to find are IP addresses, MAC addresses, and open ports, to name a few. Well, this tells us all three of those. It will tell you live hosts on your network, and it will provide IP addresses for those hosts. It will provide open ports that identify the services that are running on that machine. And it will also tell you the MAC address for each specific device. You may not understand what any of those mean or do. That's okay. My point in this is just to share that Nmap is a really nice tool. In fact, I actually wrote a script that takes Nmap and sort of automates this information gathering process. So it allows us to essentially track down new devices on our network and inventory them pretty quickly and jot all this information down. So I have a decent amount of experience with Nmap. If you're interested in using this program and just need to know where to get started, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to kind of show you the ropes, how it works. Super helpful program for just helping us gather all this information, because it is a lot, but it's important information that we need to know. So just let me know if you want to learn more about Nmap. But anyways, back to our inventory. Once we've listed out all of the hardware and all of the associated information, now it's time to start to look at the software. As we're going to discuss with software whitelisting in 2 weeks, software is definitely something that you're going to want to be tightly controlling. So instead of simply just jotting down a list of software that you use, we would recommend that instead you create what's known as a baseline. And a software baseline is essentially going to be your approved list of software that your employees can use. And the use of any other software must be approved by your IT department following something like a security impact analysis. As we'll discuss in detail in a couple of weeks, and we talk about patching, old and forgotten software is another huge security risk that you absolutely want to avoid. And something like a software baseline can help you do that. And although creating a list of approved software doesn't actually do anything to enforce it, that's where we need other controls like software whitelisting to come into play to help us actually enforce what we're trying to do. So software baseline, super nice. In fact, there is a section on the template, the software baseline here. First, I should mention the hardware inventory. This is where you want to document all the hardware. As you can see, we've included lots and lots of different hardware component information that you can fill out. There is lots here. So start with the basics that I mentioned and then sort of work your way out. But this is a great resource to do that. This is going to be a living, breathing document, meaning that as you add new employees, as employees leave, as you add new hardware, as you take away new hardware, as you update hardware, information here is going to change. And so it's a living, breathing document in that it takes effort to stay on top of this. And so definitely keep that in mind. This is not something you just sort of fill out and forget about. I'm in our system inventory probably like every day, to be honest. But that's the hardware inventory. The software baseline, this is what it looks like. As you can see, you can identify the groups that the software applies to, the type of software, the name of the software, the vendor, the version that is being run, as well as some account information that the software is applicable to. So that's our software baseline. Super nice. And then finally, the last point when it comes to inventory is that when you are performing your inventory, it's crucial that you also list out all of your users and their associated permission levels, since these are the folks who are going to be directly accessing your IT system components, your hardware and your software and the information. But you need to know exactly who is accessing what and the system permissions that have been granted to them. And hopefully you have been granting system permissions. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about restricting admin privileges with our fifth control. So hopefully you are doing that, but if not, we'll discuss that more in a few weeks. But we need to know what technical capabilities our users have, if those are correct, and what we're doing to track that over time. So let's jump back to the template here. We have two sheets that relate to like permissions and tracking your users. First would be your contact list. So you can identify the role of each specific user. We listed out some examples here, some specific information pertaining to their contact information, as well as their privileged access, what accounts they have access to, just to sort of give you an idea of the scope of what they're able to do, and if their account were to be compromised, what an attacker would also be able to do. So super helpful. We also have a duties and responsibilities sheet. This might be a little overwhelming to start, because with this you can actually like drill down to the individual like duty assigned to a specific person, and in this case assigned to multiple people. So personally, I would recommend you start with the contact list, make sure you identify what privileged access they might have, then move to duties and responsibilities. But this is there to help you. When you get to that stage, eventually, you're going to want to do this. It's extremely helpful, but it might be a little, excuse me, a little overwhelming to start. So I think that's all I wanted to cover with the system inventory. We have, when all is said and done, we will have put a lot of information on this guy, and our list will probably be pretty long. And so lists are great in that they help us to track and manage things over time. I'm not bagging on spreadsheets. I think they're helpful. In fact, necessary, but they do have a significant weakness, in my opinion, that they don't really, just looking at a list of hardware or software, they don't really help you understand how each of these system components fit into the grand scheme of our overall collective network. You know, like what what sorts of things can I learn about how my network operates, where information is flowing, just by looking at a list of hardware, software? Probably not much. So this is what, well, really, thankfully, that's why something like diagrams exist. And they help us to really just take all of the confusing and the jumbled information that we've listed out and really begin to make sense of it. We strongly recommend that your organization look to create two specific diagrams, the first being a network topology diagram, and the second a data flow diagram. The ones I have on the screen here may look intimidating. You may have never seen something like this before, but hopefully these are actually quite simple to understand and begin building yourself. So a network topology diagram really will take all of the hardware components that you listed out in your hardware inventory and show how they are either physically or logically connected. And you can see my very basic, very rudimentary example on the screen here. Yours will look quite different from this. Again, this is just a very basic example to help us understand the need for a diagram. But you can see, hopefully pretty clearly, the structure of this network and how different devices are connected to and relate with one another. In fact, let me laser pointer. We'll say, like, for example, if this workstation wants to access a cloud resource, they want to reach up to the cloud and download something. Well, that workstation will connect to the switch, which will connect to the router, which will connect to the ISP, the internet service provider, which will reach out to the cloud, grab that resource, which will make its way back to the workstation. So very, very basic example, but this helps give us an idea of how all of our IT assets are talking to one another, how they're related to one another, sort of the flow of the resources, so to speak. On the other hand, we have a data flow diagram, and this essentially combines the information lifecycle that we identified earlier with our IT assets that facilitate that lifecycle. So, for example, in this diagram, I've laid out what something like a basic manufacturing data flow environment could look like. So, for example, we could say that the sensitive information starts on the workstation. Someone creates what they call CNC file, which is going to be read by a machine. So a user will take that file from the workstation, put it on a USB, transfer it to the machine so that the machine can read it and begin building the product. Other sensitive information could travel to things like a file server, which is then backed up to the cloud, or maybe directly from the workstation to the cloud. Sensitive information could travel from something like a scanner to the workstation, maybe from a workstation to a printer, and ultimately to its disposal. So just a very basic idea of how your data could be flowing in your environment. It's important that we consider this and be able to diagram this, put this into some form that we can easily understand, that isn't just a list. But also I would remind you to keep in mind that as with our lists, these diagrams will change as well. So as your lists change and your environment changes, you'll want to be sure to update your diagrams as well. But feel free to use my very basic diagrams as just another tool at your disposal. These can be just a very basic starting point for you as you look to do the same. So at this point, we have identified the information we want to protect. We've characterized its life cycle in our environment. We've described the IT system components that are used to facilitate that life cycle. And we've laid out a complete hardware inventory and software baseline and then followed those up with diagrams. And we are nearly done, but there's one more question that we need to consider. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I did want to touch on it briefly. And the final question we ought to consider is this: how are our systems connecting to other systems, and what information are they sharing? As we saw in our data flow diagram, information is flowing inside our organization. We know that. But what about sensitive information that we are sending outside of our organization? Well, we need to track this down too. And we describe these as external interconnections, kind of a fancy term, but this chart on the slide here is taken from the external intercon inventory on the spreadsheet. I believe it is this guy, just right here. So you can change this however you want. These are some examples that are specific to like a DoD contractor's environment. So feel free to change these however you see fit. But as you can see, we're going to want to describe the external systems that we are sending this information to, as well as the purpose for that connection, what sensitive information is being shared. Are we sharing all of it? Are we only sharing some? If only some, what? We have to know these things because really anywhere that we are sending this information to, I would say should be considered in our scope, though it's kind of a loose scope because we're not managing them, but we need to account for where we're sending it. And so it should be included in our scope. Obviously, there isn't anything wrong with sending information outside of your organization. That's part of business. But we want to have an idea of where we are sending this information to, why we are doing so, and especially how we're making an effort to protect those connections. So something like the first thing that comes to mind is like secure file share. Are we using some form of an encrypted connection to send information like an engineering drawing to a vendor or to a supplier, to a customer, right? Just one basic example. So this step is definitely important, definitely necessary, but I've thrown a lot at you, so I would recommend that you start by focusing on completing your hardware and software inventory, identifying the information life cycles before you move to this step. And once you complete those, then move on to this. Well, with these questions answered, we now have the information that we need to support the development of our mature cybersecurity program. So as I kind of start to wrap this thing up and be happy to take any questions, let's first take a look at some of my key takeaways from the session. Again, I know I threw a lot at you, and the things we discussed weren't super technical in nature. Hopefully, these are just the building blocks to give us what we need moving forward throughout this series. So my first takeaway for you, if you're taking notes or something, is that knowing your assets starts with identifying information that is valuable to you. Again, if you don't know what information is of value to you, like how do you know what you're trying to protect with the rest of these controls? So we need to consider that. Second, be sure to identify the life cycle of that valuable information, and then you can start hitting the ground running with your hardware and software inventories. My third takeaway for you is that all of these things working together are what is going to set you up to succeed in the long run. As we work our way through this series, I'm going to be referring back to know your assets, know your assets, know your assets over and over and over again. And so this is a necessary place to start. And so we need to strongly, I would encourage you to strongly think about these things that I've discussed today. And then finally, thinking back on our phishing example, we know that knowing your assets is important, but how could knowing your assets have actually helped us reduce the risk of that phishing email being successful. Well, although it may not have had a direct impact, one way that knowing your assets helps in mitigating that risk is this. Knowing your assets, like we talked about, is more than just knowing. It's more than just knowing the hardware and software you have. It also includes knowing the people, the users that you have. If your IT training and awareness staff knew that, oh, this person is a system user, meaning that they use and access IT system resources, these specific resources that we have listed out in our inventory, they would know to include you in the cybersecurity training, and where you would learn to deal with something like phishing. So although it may not directly reduce the risk of a phishing attack, it is giving us everything that we need to be able to do so. And without it, the risk of a successful phishing attack it skyrockets. So user training, this ties nicely to what we're going to be discussing next week, and how there, again, is, in my opinion, few things more effective in fighting phishing threats than cybersecurity user training, than a trained and aware workforce. And so hopefully all of these things I've said today sort of make sense. I did want to, in closing, make it clear that one of the reasons why we're here, why Totem exists, is to walk alongside you during your cybersecurity journey. So please be sure to reach out to me, to our info box, if you have any questions about anything we've discussed, if you just need some help with basic cybersecurity. I personally love talking about all of this, and we'd be happy to be a resource for you. So with that, I don't see any questions in the Q&A, so I'm happy to take any other questions as we close out our session today.
Yeah, as people are thinking about some questions here, type them in the chat or Q&A. I just want to, reiterate, this is complicated stuff, right? And that's why we're putting on this series, is to try to break this down into really manageable pieces that, week by week, you can learn more about attack areas for bad actors and how to really protect yourself against that. And just understanding the assets that you have in front of you, that's a big step in that direction, because if you don't know what you have, you don't know what can be vulnerable. So thank you so much, Nathan. Any parting words as we wrap up here?
I would just say that this first step, it seems a little tedious. It seems a little boring if you were coming into this series expecting to hear a lot about threats and vulnerabilities and ransomware stuff. We will get there, I assure you. But this is, like Joey said, the starting point. And so once you've done this, then you're ready to hit the ground running with a successful cybersecurity program. So,
all right, perfect. Thank you so much, Nathan. And everyone, please make sure to register for the next week's session. We'll send that out here with the recording, so you have that link to the Eventbrite. We'll be here, every Wednesday for the next 9 or 10 Wednesdays as we work through this awesome webinar series. So stay warm, try to avoid the nice terrible storm that's coming up, and we'll see you back here next Wednesday. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.